What's up, cool people? My name's Matt, aka That Random Christian Gamer. Welcome to tonight's live stream. I figured I'd give us some music that feels more like the kind of weather I would prefer to have rather than what we've got right now. Oh man, I don't know about you, but my area has had some snow over the past week or two. Actually, I think at least 2 of the past 3 weeks, church got moved to just online only because of snow. And we're supposed to get potentially a bunch more this weekend. So yeah, fun stuff. And there's a whole bunch of really cold days in the middle of that too. Anyway, so yeah, this music is just to warm us up in spirit, you might say. So, tonight's live stream is going to be a little different than normal, even than the new normal, and a little bit shorter as well. Because basically, I am going into work tomorrow to help out with some new stuff that's being set up. That's kind of the general gist of it, and helping to organize things all over again. So because of that, I'm doing a slightly shorter stream, but so it doesn't feel like it's just lessening things, I am adding an extra chapter of Bible study, which I would have wanted to at some point along the line, so then we could, have a solid end of reading Nehemiah one week and start of, I guess, Esther's the next book after that, rather than doing one chapter of each in a given stream. Plus, I might eventually want to try and work on getting a backlog of videos that are recorded and ready to go. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, 3 chapters of Bible study, specifically Nehemiah 7 through 9. You probably saw that in the title of the stream. Hello, Seth. Hope you are doing well. So yeah. 3 Bible study chapters, Nehemiah 7 through 9. That's what's happening in today's stream. Feel free to, discuss stuff along the way, especially if it's relevant to the Bible study. But yeah, the normal toss a little bit of gaming in there isn't happening this time around, because schedule stuff. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead, run the early set of Twitch ads, and then I'll get into the Bible study. See you on the flip side, Twitch folks. Also, is that still a somewhat common phrase for people to say, see you on the flip side? I don't know. That might have been that was definitely more popular in, I don't know, some decade around when I was growing up. Anyway. There we go. I was like, it doesn't seem to be showing the window that I want to, but it's okay. It was just a little bit delayed. All right. So, yeah. Work has been interesting the past week, because there's more stuff has been changing. Shocker. Feels like it's been, I don't know, once every month or 2 that we've had a notable change to my work since I started. In this particular case, we have some people that supply some of the parts that we use starting to, manage the inventory of those parts themselves. So yeah. That's really the big reason for the big change and why I'm going into work tomorrow and stuff like that. Perhaps more so in my case to help organize the rest of the stuff after those people are done organizing their part of it. So anyway, that's all I got as far as updates and stuff. Well, not necessarily, because I don't know how long I'll be working tomorrow, so tomorrow's normal stream could very well just be pushed off to Saturday. I don't know. We'll see. Alright. I think we're about ready for some Bible study here. So let's get started. So, we are looking at Nehemiah chapter 7. So far, we've had, Nehemiah here, a less than great report about Jerusalem and the exiles who returned there, especially regarding the wall and how they were lacking protection, and he wanted to fix the wall. So he asks the king if he can go, and the king lets him go. So he goes, takes a look at the damage, gets some help from the people there to start fixing the wall. Some others around them aren't too fond of the idea, but then again, they weren't exactly friends with God's people before any of this happened anyway. So, just last chapter, we got the end of the whole wall building effort. And I think the start of this chapter is actually within the same sort of heading subsection as the end of chapter 6, where it's talking about the builders completing the wall. Yeah, so that whole process, by the way, happened in just 52 days, apparently. Even though, they kind of got slowed down after a while so they could be on high alert because they were getting threats from people around them. Yeah. But wall has been built. It's all, well, that is all good anyway. And I guess we'll see what else happens as we get into chapter 7 here. So here we go. After the wall was finished and I had set up the doors in the gates, the gatekeepers, singers, and Levites were appointed. I gave the responsibility of governing Jerusalem to my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, for he was a faithful man who feared God more than most. I said to them, "Do not leave the gates open during the hottest part of the day. And even while the gatekeepers are on duty, have them shut and bar the doors. Appoint the residents of Jerusalem to act as guards, everyone on a regular watch. Some will serve at sentry posts and some in front of their own homes." Gave the responsibility of governing Jerusalem to his brother. I don't know how fully effective that... if it was more he was handing off the... it does say responsibility here, so not necessarily the title, because I think... I don't know if it was... I think it was chapter 5, looking at the subsections, where he mentions, being governor for 12 years. So, the wall project only took 52 days, so clearly he spent more time as governor. But maybe in title he was governor and he had some of the responsibility, but other parts of it he had his brother handle from this point forward. Anyway, note there in verse 3 could say, "Keep the gates of Jerusalem closed until the sun is hot." Well, that's kind of the opposite of the way it reads here. And there would be possibly, like, totally different motivations for wanting to do one versus the other. I am not entirely sure what their particular reasons would be for, or Nehemiah's particular reason would be for wanting it one way or the other. In any case, they were supposed to, keep it one way for the early part of the day and the other way for the other part. I don't know. So it's like it was a scheduled thing, not necessarily just a, open it whenever type situation. So I guess at least there was some regularity to it like that. Just like the guard duties that he's suggesting. So maybe that was the whole purpose of his statement there. Anyway. Alright, on to verse 4. Certain parts of this are going to be like this, and I'll need to highlight them, but also have a lot of rapid-fire short verses. It would seem like a lot if you look at the number of verses at the end of the chapter, but it's not that ridiculous because a bunch of them are really short. Anyway, it'll take a long time if I keep blabbling and messing up my words. If I keep blabbing and messing up my words. So, on to verse 4. At that time, the city was large and spacious, but the population was small, and none of the houses had been rebuilt. So my God gave me the idea to call together all the nobles and leaders of the city, along with the ordinary citizens, for registration. I had found the genealogical record of those who had first returned to Judah. This is what was written there. Here is the list of the Jewish exiles of the provinces who returned from their captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar had deported them to Babylon, but now they returned to Jerusalem and the other towns in Judah where they originally lived. Their leaders were Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Realiah, Nehemiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Bana. No, this is still part of the same verse. So, this is the number of men of Israel who returned from exile. And this is where I'll have to kind of highlight it. Okay. Number of men of Israel who returned from exile. From the family of Parosh, 2,172. This is just men, so we're clear. From the family of Shephatiah, 372. From the family of Era, 652. From the family of Pahath Moab, descendants of Jeshua and Moab and Joab, 2,818. Family of Elam, 1,254. Family of Zatu, 845. I'm wondering how similar this is going to be to what was in Ezra. Anyway, maybe I could compare notes later. I think we left off at the family of Zekai, 760. Family of Bani, 648. Family of Bibai, 628. Family of Asgad, 2322. From Adonikim, 667. From Bigvai, 2067. From Aden, 655. From Ater, descendants of Hezekiah, 98. From Hashem, 328. From Bizai, 324. From Jorah, 112. From Gibar, 95. From the people of Bethlehem and Netophah, 188. People of Anathoth, 128. From Beth Asmaveth, 42. From Kiriath Jearim, Kephirah, and Beeroth, 743. From Ramon Geba, 621. From Michmash, 122. From Bethel and Ai, 123. From West Nebo, 52. From West Elam, 1,254. Yeah, I remember commenting on that, but I'll get back to that in a sec. From Harim, 320. From Jericho, 345. From Lod, Hated, and Ono, 721. And from Senea, 3,930. I missed highlighting that part, but that's 3,930. In case you can't read that. Because I didn't highlight it right. Anyway. Alright, so yeah, that was all the men who returned. Okay, pausing there for a sec. Hi, Owl. I'm doing alright, bracing for more cold weather and snow, which it can be a little bit inconvenient. So this is Nehemiah chapter 7. This is, so, long story short, God's people, you know, they had their kingdom, the kingdom split. Those kingdoms, after a while, got conquered by other nations. At the time, Persia was the big empire, but the one Persian king heard from God to go rebuild, like the same God that, you know, the Israelites worshipped. So they set off to rebuild the temple in Ezra, and Nehemiah focuses on rebuilding the wall and maybe some other structures of Jerusalem in particular. So at this point, the wall has been rebuilt, but there's still like houses haven't even been repaired or rebuilt. And so there's still a lot of work to do to really get the people back on their feet. Nehemiah had the idea to take a census of the people, and then the way that it's worded here, it sounds like he found a record of that. Found the genealogical record of those who had first returned to Judah. So, yeah. Sorry, I said a census. You said registration. So, I guess he's, for whatever reason, maybe to have an idea of how many houses might need to be rebuilt or something like that. He is trying to get a sense of how many people might need shelter or something along those lines. I'm not sure, but he wants to register the people, found this record, and it lists off a bunch of people who had returned from exile, because they were, as it, I think it says it in here, it says they were deported essentially from where they lived in Jerusalem, or even more broadly Judah, maybe even Israel as a whole. They were deported from there and possibly scattered around when Babylon took over, and then Persia conquered Babylon, and so, yeah, anyway. So yeah, this is a listing and numbering of all the men who returned from exile at this particular point, not long after the wall was rebuilt. I'm sure there are going to be a bunch of notes next to these names about the Hebrew reading a little different, or there being alternate spellings or things like that. So I'm kind of going to just brush over those at this point. So this one mentions a parallel text at Ezra 2:2. Hebrew here reads Azariah, not Saraiah. Same here. It says Nehemiah in the Hebrew text of Nehemiah. Also, this name is also paralleled in Ezra. Hebrew here reads Mispereth, rather than Mispar. Reads Nehum here rather than Rehum. Hebrew for that name reads Binuai instead of Benai. Hebrew reads Harif instead of Jorah here. But also the J might have actually been pronounced more like a Y. Harif, Jorah, I don't know. Gibbar could have been Gibeon instead. Instead of West Nebo, it might have said the other Nebo. Same here with West Elam. I definitely remember Elam being mentioned up here. Is there Nebo mentioned? I don't remember seeing Nebo. So why is there a West Nebo if there wasn't a different Nebo? Not sure. But I remember reading a list a lot like this, perhaps even exactly like this, back in Ezra, because I distinctly remember the mentions of Elam and West Elam, and the fact that both had the exact same number of men who returned from exile. So, yeah. And considering Nehemiah here says that he found the genealogical record. So, maybe it wasn't even necessarily Ezra who put the effort, or maybe this was some genealogical record that was devoid of any particular efforts on the parts of Nehemiah or Ezra. I'm not totally sure about that, but I'm pretty sure it's the same genealogical record. Okay. Since it's genealogy stuff, I don't have a whole lot else to say about that section. So, I will go ahead and move along to verse 39. Gonna do some of this to make it more readable. Alright. These are the priests who returned from exile. Priests specifically, not just any regular people. Anyway. From the family of Jedaiah through the line of Jeshua, 973. From the family of Immer, 1052. From the family of Pashur, 1247. From the family of Harim, 1017. And these are the Levites who returned from exile. From the families of Jeshua and Kadmiel, descendants of Hodaviah, 74. From the singers of the family of Asaph, or maybe these people were the singers. Anyway, 148. Of the gatekeepers of the families of Shalom, Ater, Talmon, Akub, Hatita, I don't know, and Shobai, 138. Let's also include the temple servants here, because why not? The descendants of the following temple servants returned from exile: Zihah, Hasufa, Taboth, Keros, Siaha, Padon, Lebanah, Hagabah, Shalmai, Hanan, Gidel, Gehar, Reaiah, Rezin, Nakoda, Gazam, Uzzah, Pasia, Besai, Meunim, Nephusim, Bakbuk, Hakufa, Harher, Basluth, Mehida, Harsha, Barkos, Sisera, Tima, Neziah, and Hatifa. Descendants of these servants of King Solomon returned from exile: Sotai, Hasophereth, Perida, Jela, Darkon, Giddel, Shephatiah, Hatil, Polkareth, Hazabame, and Ami? I don't know. In all, the temple servants and the descendants of Solomon's servants numbered 392. Okay, I'll pause there for a bit. Okay. Sorry, looking at comment there. It's just me, here's the Twitch chat and YouTube chat merged on the stream setup. It's actually supposed to be like that. This little box right here is supposed to be a multi-chat display. So people who are watching can see any of the comments from either platform and know what I'm reacting to. So, yes, it is like that, and that's intentional. Okay. More names and genealogy stuff. I don't have too much else to comment on with all that. So this particular bit basically included any and all the people who would have done any sort of, like, serving in the temple or serving the leaders or whatever. So, like, the priests, obviously serving in the temple. Levites, serving the priests in the temple. Other temple servants. Not quite sure about the other servants or the others descended from the servants of Solomon. Whether they were necessarily also, you know, kind of servants by birth. Because at this point they had been in exile and there wasn't really... I don't think they were necessarily serving the Persian king. At least not directly. I don't know. But 392, I assume that just covers this section here, where it mentions the temple servants and the servants of King Solomon. Because this, I mean, the priests definitely more than 300 some, and it's pretty close to that. Yeah, it's fairly close to that number just with the Levites. So I assume the 392 mentioned here are these other servants that are mentioned. Okay. More notes at names. The Hebrew there has an E, or sorry, it reads Hodeva instead of Hodaviah. Close enough. Hebrew there reads Saya or Sia instead of Sayaha. Nefusim would be read as Nefushesim. Basluth might be Baslith. Again, a lot of these are just going to be like alternate spellings or things like that, where it's like, it's probably referring to the same person, just might be like a dialect kind of difference or some other spelling that people used in a different area or as time passed. I don't know. Anyway. Perida here. Oh, okay. Hebrew here reads Sotai, that's the same. Sophareth rather than Hasophareth. And Perida instead of Peruda. Still, all very close. That one, Hebrew reads Jala without the H at the end. Okay, sure. Again, very close, whatever, in my opinion. We'd be here forever if I tried to, if I, A, knew the Hebrew well enough, and B, took the time and effort to try and break down potential differences in meaning of names. Hebrew here reads Ammon instead of Ammai. But again, there's the parallel text in Ezra 2. So I think the translators, for the sake of consistency, went with what was previously mentioned. Okay. And now we continue at verse 61. Yes, we're already that far because of how many verses were just rapid fire in here. Another group returned at this time from the towns of Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adon, and Immer. However, they could not prove that they or their families were descendants of Israel. This group included the families of Delaiah, Tobiah, and Nekoda, a total of 642 people. 3 families of priests, Hobiah, Hakkoz, and Barzillai, also returned. This Barzillai had married a woman who was a descendant of Barzillai of Gilead, and he had taken her family name. They searched for their names in the genealogical records, but they were not found, so they were disqualified from serving as priests. The governor told them not to eat the priest's share of food from the sacrifices until the priest could consult the Lord about the matter by using the Urim and Thummim, the sacred lots. So a total of 42,360 people returned to Judah, in addition to 7,337 servants and 245 singers, both men and women. They took with them 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. Took with them as they returned from the exile, I assume. Some of the family leaders gave gifts for the work. The governor gave to the treasury 1,000 gold coins, 50 gold basins, and 530 robes for the priests. The other leaders gave to the treasury a total of 20,000 gold coins and some 2,750 pounds of silver for the work. The rest of the people gave 20,000 gold coins, about 2,500 pounds of silver, and 67 robes for the priests. So the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and some of the common people settled near Jerusalem. The rest of the people returned to their own towns throughout Israel. That wording sounds very, very similar to what I remember reading in Ezra. So, I almost wonder if this, whole section here, when it's talking about the genealogical record and beyond, was pretty much all the same thing. Derived from the same source when it was originally written. So, more names along with some things that were brought so they could have some livestock and supplies, for the return from exile. And I would think, again, since there wasn't any other mention of more people returning, unless this thing right here is meant to apply to... No, because that just says 642 people. So, yeah. The 42,360 in all, I assume, is the broader summation of every group mentioned in this chapter. And possibly the parallel chapter in Ezra. Makes me wonder if, this sort of... the timing of this sort of coincides with that chapter in Ezra. Anyway, note there at Adon mentions the parallel text. Hebrew reads Adon rather than Adan. Note there 245 mules. That's coming from some of the Hebrew manuscripts, also mentioned in Ezra 266. Most Hebrew manuscripts lack this verse. So then verses 7, or chapter 7, verses 69 through 73 are numbered one less, essentially, in those Hebrew texts. 1,000 gold coins. Hebrew says 1,000 derricks of gold, which would have been about 19 pounds or 8.6 kilograms. 20,000 gold coins. It says 20,000 derricks, which would have been 375 pounds. So, yeah. And the Hebrew there says 2,200 minas. Just, again, this is all like conversion stuff. And just notes there to say, hey, here's what it actually originally said. In the main body of the text, though, it's already calculated into a unit of measure that, or it's into some form that a more modern reader would at least have a clue what that is. Okay. Technically, verse 73 includes this little bit here, but because that stops mid-sentence, I'm actually not going to include that in my reading of chapter 7. I will include it when I read chapter 8. I don't really have a whole lot of other thoughts, because this was mostly genealogy and, you know, detail-oriented kinds of things like that. There's not really much to, you know, there's not really much to derive, you know, possible meanings or applications or further insights. So, yeah, sometimes I scroll back and forth like this just to double check that nothing really stands out that I want to say anything more about. But, oh, yeah, speaking of which, these three families, they were families of priests, but they were not allowed to serve as priests, essentially, until the other verified priests could consult God on whether or not these people were who they said they were and, you know, were actually, you know, of the proper lineage to be serving as priests in the temple. Okay, that was, I'm pretty sure, the only other thing I wanted to mention to any extent. So that does it for Nehemiah chapter 7. All right. One of 3 in tonight's live stream because, in case you missed it, live stream's going to be a bit short because I'm going into work tomorrow for an undisclosed amount of time. Actually, I should say an unknown amount of time. Depends on how quickly certain things progress. But rather than just have it be like, yeah, I'm cutting the stream off shorter than normal, I'm like, let's add a little bit of something that there normally wouldn't be as much of. And because Nehemiah has an odd number of chapters, so eventually I was going to need to do an odd number in a stream to have a clean break between Nehemiah 1 week and Esther, I think, is next. I could double check that fact real quick. Or I could wait until there's an ad break, so as not to interrupt the main Bible study stuff and people potentially hearing it and reading along and all that. Okay, on to the next chapter. Alright. So we're looking at Nehemiah chapter 8 now. But I will backtrack to the end of chapter 7 because the start of this sentence is kind of at the end of that chapter. It's weird. But before I get into that, So Nehemiah came to Jerusalem. The wall has been rebuilt after being just decimated when, Judah was conquered and all that. And it only took 52 days, I think it read. 52 days. So they fixed the wall, but then there were still, other homes and things like that were in disrepair. So, the people still weren't really as settled and safe and, sheltered as they could be. So, chapter 7 mostly involved a genealogical record that Nehemiah found. I guess he wanted to register them. For what reason, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out as we continue. But yeah, he found all these records about the people who returned from exile and what connected them to Israel in the first place. So, I guess that's all I've got to kind of catch us up to speed. So, starting technically from the end of chapter 7, here we go. Now, this mentions October. I'm thinking I think the latest date mentioned was actually back in chapter 6. Okay, well, it says October 2nd there, so same month at least. Doesn't say when within October. But anyway, in October, when the Israelites had settled in their towns, real quick note there, Hebrew says in the 7th month. This month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar occurred within the months of October and November of 445 BC. So it says October here, maybe could have been early November too. Anyway, in October/November, when the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people assembled with a unified purpose at the square just inside the water gate. They asked Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given for Israel to obey. So on October 8th, Ezra the priest brought the book of the law before the assembly, which included the men and women and all the children old enough to understand. He faced the square just inside the water gate from early morning until noon and read aloud to everyone who could understand. All the people listened closely to the book of the law. Ezra the scribe stood on a high wooden platform that had been made for the occasion. To his right stood Mattithiah, Shema, Ananiah, Uriah, Hilkiah, and Maaseiah. Not sure about the pronunciation there. To his left stood Pedaiah, Mishael, Malchijah, Hashum, Hashbaddanah, Zechariah, and Meshullam. Ezra stood on the platform in full view of the people. When they saw him open the book, they all rose to their feet. Okay, pausing there for a bit. So, we officially have the crossover of Ezra and Nehemiah. Those of you who don't know, these were actually originally, at least as far as we can tell, based on manuscripts that are available, if my knowledge is correct, scholars had original, or as close to original documents as possible, where Ezra and Nehemiah were actually on the same document, probably a scroll. So, it kind of makes sense that there would be crossover. So, I think a lot of what has happened in the book of Nehemiah so far took place within the timeline of the events of the book of Ezra. And now it's like, I think it mentioned in Ezra about, reading the book of the law to the people. So, assuming that's correct, whenever it was mentioned in Ezra, that's where we are in the timeline here in Nehemiah. So we have sort of a connecting point. Note there says October 8th. Hebrew says on the first day of the 7th month. Okay. Yeah, since it mentions a specific day on the Hebrew lunar calendar, and there were records connected to, other sources like, Persian records and such. Now they're able to say specific dates when these things happened. So, Ezra has been asked to read the law of Moses, aka God's laws, to the people, because these are God's people, and they understandably want to know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to live. But, especially with them being exiled for what I believe to be at least 60 years. They've had pretty much a full generation at least to potentially drift away from those laws in their behaviors, and also, not potentially hear or read those laws for themselves. So, yeah. Anyway, Ezra's doing the reading, or at least getting ready to do the reading, and it kind of describes the scene here a bit with where they met in the town and people that were around Ezra, and he was on a platform that was made just for this occasion, apparently. And so, as he starts to read, they all rose to their feet, it says. And then we get to verse 6. Then Ezra praised the Lord, the great God, and all the people chanted, Amen, Amen, as they lifted their hands. They bowed down and worshipped the Lord with their faces to the ground. The Levites, Jeshua, Bani, Sherebiah, Jamin, Akub, Shabbathai, Hodiah, Maaseiah, Kelita, I don't know, Azariah, Jozabad, Hanan, and Pelaiah then instructed the people in the law, while everyone remained in their places. They read from the book of the law of God and clearly explained the meaning of what was being read, helping the people understand each passage. And that right there is particularly helpful, because, you could read a bunch of stuff, but if the people don't understand it, they're not gonna be able to follow it. Now, in what way these Levites instructed the people beyond Ezra reading it, I'm not sure. But it was definitely more than just, all right, I'm going to read this in front of everybody. Okay, y'all got that? So, yeah. Sorry. There's that early morning wake up catching up with me a little bit. All right. So there's I think it's plain enough here to see that, all right, after this, the people living there in Judah and the surrounding area, or at least just Jerusalem, should have known God's laws to a decent extent and what they were supposed to do and how they should live and all that. So, then we have verse 9. Then Nehemiah the governor, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who were interpreting for the people said to them, "Don't mourn or weep on such a day as this, for today is a sacred day before the Lord your God." For the people had all been weeping as they listened to the words of the law. And Nehemiah continued, "Go and celebrate with a feast of rich foods and sweet drinks, and share gifts of food with people who have nothing prepared. This is a sacred day before our Lord. Don't be dejected and sad, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." And the Levites too quieted the people, telling them, "Hush, don't weep, for this is a sacred day." So the people went away to eat and drink at a festive meal, to share gifts of food, and to celebrate with great joy, because they had heard God's words and understood them. That really makes me wonder why they were weeping in the first place. It could be because they felt significant guilt from having not lived that way, up to this point. I'm imagining most of these people, at least, were not alive pre-exile. So it would have been that much easier for them to not know God's laws and not follow them and all of that. And with this being then the first time that they heard it, and there could have been, there's all sorts of possibilities for how they could have, disobeyed those laws, especially while they were exiled. But whatever their reason for weeping, essentially the leaders around them, in their way, encourage the people and say, "Look, this is actually a great and momentous occasion, because now we have all heard the words of, or the laws of our God, and now we know how we should live, rather than continuing in a, utterly clueless lifestyle that could be far off from what's commanded here." And I do find it interesting that there's a specific mention to, give food to the people who, the way that it's worded pretty easily implies that, people who have nothing prepared, the reason they would have nothing prepared is because they don't really have much to begin with. So, essentially, including the poorer folks among them in this feast. Note there at Nehemiah, Hebrew just says he, which, it mentioned Nehemiah and Ezra and the Levites. Although, since Nehemiah was first in that list, he would kind of imply, the pronoun he would kind of imply Nehemiah more than the others. But translators probably went, "Nope, let's make it abundantly clear." But also note that there was an ever so slight chance that it didn't mean Nehemiah here. Okay. So, celebrations. And this was on October 8th. So now we continue to verse 13. On October 9th, the family leaders of all the people, together with the priests and Levites, met with Ezra the scribe to go over the law in greater detail. As they studied the law, they discovered that the Lord had commanded through Moses that the Israelites should live in shelters during the festival to be held that month. He had said that a proclamation should be made throughout their towns and in Jerusalem, telling the people to go to the hills to get branches from olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees. They were to use these branches to make shelters in which they would live during the festival as prescribed in the law. So the people went out and cut branches and used them to build shelters on the roofs of their houses, in their courtyards, in the courtyards of God's temple, or in the squares just inside the water gate and the Ephraim gate. So everyone who had returned from captivity lived in these shelters during the festival, and they were all filled with great joy. The Israelites had not celebrated like this since the days of Joshua son of Nun. Ezra read from the book of the law of God on each of the 7 days of the festival. Then on the 8th day they held a solemn assembly as was required by law. For the Festival of Shelters, I think, more specifically. So yeah, turns out right after they initially meet together to read/hear the law. Well, I was about to say the law of Moses, which I think is how it technically refers to it in here. I've been calling it God's laws because, like, that was it was likely written by Moses initially, those laws were, but he heard those from God. At least I'm pretty sure that's how it says that things happened back when that stuff was written. Anyway, just so I don't get off on a tangent, let me look at some notes here. Hebrew mentions on the 2nd day of the 7th month. Yeah. So that was October 9th, 445 BC. So it was on that day that they discovered that the Festival of Shelters was a thing. So then they do their best to hold that festival by going out and, like, getting all these branches to make the shelters that were needed for it. Now, when it mentions that month, Hebrew says in the 7th month. Again, this... See, now, hang on. This month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar usually occurs within the months of September on October, is what it says here. But I thought it said October, November previously. It's referencing Leviticus 23 in this instance. Where did I think it said that the 7th month was in October and November? Must have been some note like that in a previous chapter. Yeah, right here. Literally the first thing that I read for this section was said the 7th month there, but then this says it's within October and November. So that's a little bit conflicting there. Although, okay, so here, okay, I've noticed the difference. This one is speaking more generally about when the 7th month would be in the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. The previous mention of it, it said the 7th month, but it was like specifically that 7th month of that year. So that's why it said October, November for that one. But I guess for the most part, the 7th month fell within September and October, you know, in relation to our modern calendars. Okay, so there's the difference. It is not necessarily completely contradictory. Where it mentions the wild olive branches. Sorry. Man. Where it mentions wild olive branches, it could be pine, but the Hebrew here reads oil tree. Which, I mean, olive oil was definitely a common thing back then. So I could see the olive connection. But it might have been a pine tree. Was pine oil a thing? Maybe? I don't know. Haven't really heard of pine oil before, but certainly wouldn't rule it out, I guess. No, pine oil is not a thing. Oh, there is such a thing, but no, that's not what it would have been in this case. Is that what you're trying to say there, Seth? Also, note down here about Joshua. Hebrew says Joshua. Variant spelling. Yeah, I mean, it's one letter off. And vowels were especially a weird thing in ancient Hebrew. But yeah, Joshua, like the man who essentially led them into the promised land after they had fled from Egypt. It says they had not celebrated like this since those days. We're talking many hundreds of years, I think. So, again, it doesn't say what was similar about this celebration compared to that one, but yeah. Needless to say, it was a remarkable celebration. So Seth's here saying pine oil would not have been there likely, but there is such a thing as pine oil. Okay. But then why would the translators mention pine branches as a possibility? I would think the people who worked on translating this stuff would know a little more than me. In any case, not a big deal. Just some other, maybe only slightly different kind of tree that they got some branches from to make these shelters and stuff for the festival. And then during the festival, Ezra read from the Book of the Law each day. So they had more than just the one day to learn, which I'm sure was also quite helpful. Because if it's as much of the law as I'm thinking it is, there was a lot to learn. But anyway, yeah, so relatively good times for God's people in Nehemiah chapter 8 here. We'll see if it stays like that as things continue. But that's it for this one. Okay. Was able to wrap that up just around in time for just around the time that the Twitch ads are going to hit. So I will go ahead and roll those. But I need to switch over to a slightly different window setup thing here in the stream for me to do that. There's no little like pop-up that I can just click to initiate the ads. Anywho. Alrighty. Now I mentioned looking up what would be the next book. Y'all can't see it because of the way I have the window cropped. But yes, Esther is the next book of the Bible after Nehemiah. Alright. I'm going to have to read and talk a bit. Holy cow, that's kind of a long chapter. Great. Alright, well. Yeah, definitely gonna have to be intentional about not getting loud and speaking softer and in a more comfortable tone of voice, I guess you'd say. I think after I'm done with the stream, I might have just a little bit of like some kind of salty snack to help my throat a bit. Because I figure if people recommend gargling salt water to help a sore throat, wouldn't eating something salty have a similar effect? Kinda? Unless there's something about that snack that in and of itself would hurt your throat. Okay. So yeah. I'll be reading this chapter a bit calmer and quieter for the sake of my voice or slash throat. But here we go, I guess. Okay. So we are looking at hang on. You should have done your but first earlier. Oh, yeah. I did that during the ad break. Sorry. It is Esther. So, yeah. I mean, I've had the books of the Bible and their order pretty much memorized from quite a young age. I went to a, small private Christian school when I was really young, and so that was, I think, part of my instruction there. Anyway, all right, so now to chapter 9. Okay, Nehemiah chapter 9. So we have had Nehemiah pretty much accomplish his primary goal, at least, of building the wall around Jerusalem. And now there's been, setting more of the culture of Jerusalem and maybe Judah and Israel more broadly as well. Last chapter, they got together and Ezra, yes, Ezra from the previous book of the Bible, that Ezra started reading the book of the law, aka the law of Moses, aka God's law. He started reading that to the people. First, they just did it because they wanted to learn and know, but it also turned out that, like, the day after that, they learned about a festival that they were supposed to celebrate that month. So they prepared themselves for that festival and then had the festival for the next week. All the while, each day, Ezra is reading more of the law to the people gathered there. And that's what's been going on leading up to this chapter. So here we go. Nehemiah chapter 9. On October 31st, people assembled again, and this time they fasted and dressed in burlap and sprinkled dust on their heads. Those of Israelite descent separated themselves from all foreigners as they confessed their own sins and the sins of their ancestors. They remained standing in place for 3 hours while the book of the law of the Lord their God was read aloud to them. Then for 3 more hours they confessed their sins and worshipped the Lord their God. The Levites, Jeshua, Bani, Kadmiel, Shebaniah, Bunai, Sherebiah, Bani, and Kenani, stood on the stairway of the Levites and cried out to the Lord their God with loud voices. Okay. So, the previous gathering was started October 8th. It mentioned in the previous chapter. October 9th was when they found out about the Festival of Shelters that they then celebrated for the next week. So by the time that was done, it would have been at least the 16th. So then this is like 2 weeks later that they assembled again. Hebrew says on the 24th day of that same month, which was the 7th month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. And because there are specific cross-references from records of other people, we have the exact day. October 31st, 445 BC. So it seems to me that in this situation, all the Israelites were... I mean, it says they were confessing their sins, and that was probably also why they were, like, fasting, dressing in burlap, sprinkling dust on their heads. Those were all things that people did in times of mourning and sorrow. So, I would derive from that they were perhaps mourning the sin that they knew they had committed from hearing God's laws and realizing they had not followed that while they were exiled. So, note here where it says they remained standing in place for 3 hours. Hebrew says for a quarter of a day. Now, depending on how you define a day, I guess, is how that works. Because if you think of a day as 24 hours here, 3 hours would not be a quarter of a day. But if you shrink it down to 12 hours, which I guess it's possible even around that time of year that the actual daylight might have been there for about 12 hours. I'm not entirely sure of all the logistics of that, if that's actually accurate, but I could kind of see that maybe being the case. But yeah, so they stood for a while and listened to more of the laws. Oh, is that right around when the equinox is? I hadn't even thought that it was like that particular day necessarily. But yeah, I'm not doubting you there, Seth. I don't know when the normal date of the equinox is. The date mentioned here is October 31st of 445 BC, if that makes a difference. So it says they remained standing in place for 3 hours while the book of the law was read, and then for 3 more hours they confessed their sins and worshiped God. Okay. September 22nd would be the closest equinox around that time. So, yeah, it's like a month off. I could see there being that much daylight. Anyway, this chapter is not exactly short, and I have been talking a lot about just these first 4 verses. So let me continue here. Then the leaders of the Levites, Jeshua, Kadmiel, Bani, Hashabniah, geez, some of these names, Sherebiah, Hodiah, Shebaniah, and Pethahiah, called out to the people, "Stand up and praise the Lord your God, for he lives from everlasting to everlasting." Then they prayed, "May your glorious name be praised. May it be exalted above all blessing and praise. You alone are the Lord. You made the skies and the heavens and all the stars. You made the earth and the seas and everything in them. You preserve them all, and the angels of heaven worship you. You are the Lord God, who chose Abraham and brought him from Ur of the Chaldeans and renamed him Abraham. When he had proved himself faithful, you made a covenant with him to give him and his descendants the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and Girgashites. And you have done what you promised, for you are always true to your word. You saw the misery of our ancestors in Egypt, and you heard their cries from beside the Red Sea. You displayed miraculous signs and wonders against Pharaoh, his officials, and all his people, for you knew how arrogantly they were treating our ancestors. You have a glorious reputation that has never been forgotten. You divided the sea for your people so they could walk through on dry land. And then you hurled their enemies into the depths of the sea. They sank like stones beneath the mighty waters. You led our ancestors by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night so that they could find their way. This seems like it's going to go on quite a bit, so I will occasionally pause in the midst of this prayer/praise of God here from the people. So, it had already said they confessed their sins and worshipped, but now the Levites were specifically instructing the people to give praises to God. Again, they had just recently been exiled away from their home and, living entirely under... they still were kind of under the rule of Persia, but, they didn't have, their own laws necessarily that they would have known and followed or had ways to learn and follow. Because I guess the priests were still priests by lineage, but that, was there anywhere for them to serve as priests while they were exiled? I wouldn't think so. Unless they were given the liberty of establishing other temples or altars or places of worship within wherever they were living, that wouldn't have been the case. So it was, overall a very praiseworthy occasion. So now they're thinking back on the various things that God has done for their ancestors, probably eventually leading up to the present moment, but we'll get there when we get there. And they go all the way back even to creation itself, mentioning, that the Lord their God made the skies and the heavens and the earth. And then it gets to Abraham and Moses and the deliverance from Egypt And I left it off at verse 13, so I guess we'll continue from there. I don't really have too much else to say on that, because, again, it's like they're recalling and praising God for his mighty and, continual good deeds for their people. So after it mentions the pillar of fire and cloud, we get to verse 13. You came down at Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them regulations and instructions that were just, and decrees and commands that were good. You instructed them concerning your holy Sabbath, and you commanded them through Moses your servant to obey all your commands, decrees, and instructions. You gave them bread from heaven when they were hungry, and water from the rock when they were thirsty. You commanded them to go and take possession of the land you had sworn to give them. But our ancestors were proud and stubborn, and they paid no attention to your commands. They refused to obey and did not remember the miracles you had done for them. Instead, they became stubborn and appointed a leader to take them back to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God of forgiveness, gracious and merciful, slow to become angry, and rich in unfailing love. You did not abandon them, even when they made an idol shaped like a calf and said, "This is your God who brought you out of Egypt." They committed terrible blasphemies. Okay, hang on. Chat's active. I'm trying not to just ignore it. We can think of that to what we think present day. Like how, God continues to, do great things for those who worship him. Which, today, Christians, of course, would argue includes, the church. Those who, follow Jesus more specifically. Back in this time, of course, that would have just been, the people descended from Abraham, and even possibly more specifically than that, descended from Jacob. But, yeah, that's, like, there is practically no end to the amazing works of God. There's big, well-known examples like we read in the Bible, and there's probably all sorts of lesser, you might call them everyday examples, even now. Something about that name, the name that can move mountains and change everything. The name of the Lord. I assume that's what you mean when you say that name. But yeah, I missed a line. Where did I miss a line? Mount Sinai. Do give them regulations and instructions that were just, and decrees and commands that were good. Oh, instruct them concerning your holy Sabbath. Did I miss that part? Oh, on the... Oh, I didn't necessarily miss it. I just figured that was part of the general point that you were making. I'm not necessarily going to read out loud every single thing that's put in the chat there. But, yeah. I guess... Okay, where you mentioned that name, you were talking about your previous comment King of Kings, Lord of Lords. That's the name you were talking about. That does make it make more sense. All right. Yeah, initially it hit my chat as two different comments. Thus my separation of them. Anyway. All right. So, now the people in their moment of praise are also admitting the guilt of their ancestors, which I'm sure they felt quite heavily in a moment where they had just been confessing their own sins and acknowledging their own guilt. Note there at slavery in Egypt. It's coming from the Greek version. Hebrew reads, in their rebellion. So, instead they became stubborn and appointed a leader to take them back to their slavery in their rebellion, I guess is how that would read. Yeah, so that's making a reference to, I guess, also while they were at Mount Sinai, the whole thing with the golden calf that Aaron crafted out of the jewelry and stuff. So, after talking about that incident and the guilt therein, I think we left it off at verse 19. But in your great mercy, you did not abandon them to die in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud still led them forward by day, and the pillar of fire showed them the way through the night. You sent your good spirit to instruct them, and you did not stop giving them manna from heaven or water for their thirst. For 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. Then you helped our ancestors conquer kingdoms and nations, and you placed your people in every corner of the land. They took over the land of King Sihon of Heshbon, and the land of King Og of Bashan. You made their descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and brought them into the land you had promised to their ancestors. They went in and took possession of the land. You subdued whole nations before them. Even the Canaanites who inhabited the land were powerless. Your people could deal with these nations and their kings as they pleased. Our ancestors captured fortified cities and fertile land. They took over houses full of good things, with cisterns already dug and vineyards and olive groves and fruit trees in abundance. So they ate until they were full and grew fat and enjoyed themselves in all your blessings. Yeah, so this literally is like, it's reading kind of like a basic history of God's people. I have made efforts to come up with my own, like, abridged Bible, as I've been calling it, to summarize things. But this is probably a better overall summary of the events. Who knows? Maybe I'll, assuming I'm even alive that long to finish all this Bible study and finish off that effort too, maybe I'll eventually make my own broad summary video for the entire Bible. But that is a lot. So after the whole thing with the golden calf, they're talking about how God was still merciful and faithful while they wandered the wilderness. Still providing for their needs and guiding them. And then also, they took over the land that had been promised to their ancestors. Yeah. Summarizing all of the Bible is agreed. Not easy. Greatest story ever told. Yeah. And even what the people are praising God for in here is, again, just sort of a general summary of some things. Like, you were saying it is easy. I mean, yes, if you're looking for, like, depending on your approach, there are ways to summarize. But, like, oh crud, I'm trying to think. There's at least a verse, possibly multiple, that mentions just the endless books that could be written about all the great. Actually, I think that's in one of the Gospels, and it's specifically talking about how there could be endless books written about the deeds of Jesus in particular, if I'm remembering right. But of course, if that applies to just Jesus, how much more does that imply to the entirety of the history of God's people? So, yeah, it's pretty much any summary, there's room for people to say, like, hey, you missed this, because there's a lot to cover. And no summary worth being called a summary is likely to capture everything that might stand out to everyone individually. And that's another great thing about the Bible, is that there's different things that'll stand out to different people, and then it all comes together in this beautiful thing that we call the church. Anyway, we've got this like major vibe of almost like we're joining the people in this chapter in the praises. So, they were talking about conquering the kingdoms in the promised land and continuing the vibe, kind of. We move on to verse 26. But despite all this, the conquering and provision and all that, but despite all this, they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They turned their backs on your law. They killed your prophets who warned them to return to you, and they committed terrible blasphemies. So you handed them over to their enemies, who made them suffer. But in their time of trouble they cried to you, and you heard them from heaven. In your great mercy, you sent them liberators who rescued them from their enemies. This is basically the book of Judges right here. But as soon as they were at peace, your people again committed evil in your sight, and once more you let their enemies conquer them. Yet whenever your people turned and cried to you again for help, you listened once more from heaven. In your wonderful mercy, you rescued them many times. You warned them to return to your law, but they became proud and obstinate and disobeyed your commands. They did not follow your regulations, by which people will find life if only they obey. They stubbornly turned their backs on you and refused to listen. In your love, you were patient with them for many years. You sent your Spirit, who warned them through the prophets, but still they wouldn't listen. So once again you allowed the peoples of the land to conquer them. But in your great mercy you did not destroy them completely or abandon them forever. What a gracious and merciful God you are. So this later part might actually kind of be describing the when the people were conquered by, you know, Babylon and Persia and like those other kingdoms and such. Um, but really, I mean, there was a pattern for a while there, even a bit after Judges. Although, I mean, after the book of Judges ends, then you get to, First, Second Samuel and the King's books. So there are particular kingdoms established for God's people. And yes, it was eventually two separate kingdoms. That, they had their own rulers, so they weren't necessarily ruled and conquered in between the Judges and the end of that time frame. But, yeah, eventually that got them to, they continued to disobey. The people were conquered. And that was what led to their exile and living away from where God had promised their ancestors they would live. But then they returned, and I imagine we're going to get to that in the next section. But yeah, even despite their continued stubbornness and rebellion and disobedience, God didn't wipe them out completely. And that was the remnant that survived the exile, and at this point in Nehemiah, those were the people in this moment giving praises, the ones who had returned from that exile. So, speaking of that, let's continue in verse 32. And now our God, the great and mighty and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of unfailing love, do not let all the hardships we have suffered seem insignificant to you. Great trouble has come upon us and upon our kings and leaders and priests and prophets and ancestors, all of your people, from the days when the kings of Assyria first triumphed over us until now. Assyria was the kingdom that conquered one of the two kingdoms of God's people. By the way, every time you punished us, you were being just. We have sinned greatly, and you gave us only what we deserved. Our kings, leaders, priests, and ancestors did not obey your law or listen to the warnings in your commands and laws. Even while they had their own kingdom, they did not serve you, though you showered your goodness on them. You gave them a large, fertile land, but they refused to turn from their wickedness. So now today we are slaves in the land of plenty So now today we are slaves in the land of plenty that you gave our ancestors for their enjoyment. We are slaves here in this good land. The lush produce of this land piles up in the hands of the kings whom you have set over us because of our sins. They have power over us and our livestock. We serve them at their pleasure, and we are in great misery. But, according to this, rightly so. But they are making an effort to turn back to God. So I gotta imagine the hope is that, or even possibly the request of God is to deliver them in this time just like he delivered their ancestors previously. So, it's a joyous occasion that they've been able to return to their homes, their ancestral homes even. But at the same time, it's not all, sunshine and rainbows here, because they still have other kings ruling over them that I assume they have to pay taxes to, and there might be other officials or nobles or rich folks in general that I I will mention in relation to this, because it's like you might wonder, well, why are they slaves? Aside from being ruled by another kingdom, it could have also, in this specific moment, had to do with a famine that was mentioned back a few chapters ago that had caused some of their people to, like, fall into debt. They had to sell off their land, some of their possessions. Some of them even, like, sold themselves and or their children into slavery to try and pay off these debts that just kept growing and growing, in part because there was a famine in the land and they needed other ways to get the food and stuff to just live. But, so it's like, it's been praise, but there's also a little bit of a request at the end of this. It seems like, or at least a cry out to God saying, hey, here's our current situation and what is distressing us. With maybe sort of an implied, can you help us out here like you helped our ancestors? Oh. And then there's just verse 38. I thought there was going to be more after that, since there's a little section title here, but I guess not. So verse 38 says, the people responded, in view of all this, we are making a solemn promise and putting it in writing. On this sealed document are the names of our leaders and Levites and priests. Okay. It doesn't outright say that that's them agreeing to obey, but that may have been the solemn promise. I mean, what else would they be promising? There's also a couple of notes right here. Verse 938 is numbered 10:1 in the Hebrew text. This might be one of those things where I wonder if it would be slightly better off to have just plopped that verse, or kept that verse where it was in the Hebrew text. Because, yeah, it's the same subsection in the start of Nehemiah 10. So, yeah. Anyway. Sorry. Man. What's the note at in view of all this? Or in spite of all this is how it could read. I mean, in spite of all this might have been in spite of their, quote, misery. When read as in view of all this, I take that to apply a whole lot more broadly to what they were just saying and how, how they were just praising God, noting the times that, God's people followed his laws and things went well, and how things went poorly when they didn't follow the laws. So, yeah. Making a solemn promise related to that in particular would be the broader idea when saying in view of all this rather than in spite of. Anyway, that's just my thinking on that, because different wording kind of changes the meaning in what it could be referring to. Anyway, alright. I may reread that verse again when I do chapter 10, but for now, I don't have any other particular thoughts. So that'll wrap it up for Nehemiah chapter 9. And we'll essentially also wrap it up for the live stream, because I have to, I'm only going to set my alarm a little bit earlier than I normally would for a Friday, but I am going to set it a bit earlier, so, because of that, I'm wrapping things up a bit early. I was figuring it would maybe be around an hour and a half. That chapter took a little extra time. So that's why it crept a little closer to 2 hours. Okay. Before I take off, though, let me just say, there is still a chance that I will stream tomorrow, but I don't know for sure what all is going on at work that they're asking me to help with. So, it might be tomorrow, it might be Saturday, I don't know. Keep your eyes peeled on the timing of that. And then, of course, I would hope next Thursday will be kind of back to a more normal situation. Yeah. Man. Yep, I'm tired. About time to wrap this up. Seth has a raid target. Okay. Who you got? I mean, if you want to redeem some points, you can guide the raid, and I will be thoroughly obligated. But, yeah, without any, Warrior of Light is the only one I'm aware of offhand who is currently streaming. Well, yeah, and why use up points when you don't need to? I'm generally an agreeable raider. Alright, so, Warrior of Light 777. Aki is also a warrior. Yeah, but his Discord is Warriors of Light. Okay. Yeah, but I imagine you would have referred to him as Aki, not as Warrior. So, again, I figure you mean Warrior of Light 777. Yeah. That's the one who usually coordinates the blessing boat stuff. Okay, so that's who we're about to raid. I'm initiating that right now. I will need to kind of fade out my background music to not make this so awkward as I transition through the raid and whatnot. So, anyway, that is gonna do it from me. I hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you soon for another stream. Stay tuned to social media and stuff for any other updates on weird schedules and stuff. But, yeah. Otherwise, until the next time I see y'all, stay cool, everybody.